writing my PhD on James Baldwin, a figure who really didn't like the Beats at all, for the way that, as he saw it, they plundered African American language. He really wasn't a fan of the Beats whatsoever. Jim kindly shared lots of material that he had on Baldwin, which he'd assembled as he wrote an acclaimed biography of James Baldwin called Talking at the Gates, published by Faber, which I recommend very strongly. Many of you will know Jim's superb book, This is the Beat Generation. And some of you will have noted Jim's long interest in Trockey. From two of his books, Paris Interzone, a compelling account of writers in post-war France, including accounts of Trockey, Baldwin, and Boris Vian, and many others. And from his most recent book, Syncopations, Beats, New Yorkers, and Writers in the Dark. Jim's going to speak for roughly 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to start by asking Jim a few questions to sort of prompt a conversation, but I'd also like to leave some time for questions that you might have as well. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure. James, come on.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. And as Douglas said, I'm going to talk about Alexander Trockey, who at one point was known as the British Beat, best known British Beat, and perhaps the only British Beat. At one stage, he lived in Paris in the early 50s, where he edited the magazine Merlin with the help of Christopher Logue and Richard Seaver and other people. And then he moved to New York in the later 50s, where he became a committed and almost evangelical heroin addict, and wrote the book called Cain's Book, which I'm going to talk about a bit here. He later moved then to London in the early 60s, where he teamed up with William Burroughs. And there's a letter from Trockey to Burroughs in the second volume of Burroughs' correspondence. I think the Trockey letter is included in there, maybe it's in a footnote, in which he says something along the lines of that together with Burroughs, they're going to turn dull, dingy London into a moving place. Burroughs lived in Mayfair at the time, 8 Duke Street, St. James, which I'm going to mention here. Trockey's output was relatively thin, largely on account of his heroin addiction, but he wrote one book that we in Glasgow, in my hometown, considered a masterpiece, or a better word would be a master crime, and that was Cain's Book. I'm going to talk about that, as I said, and a bit about my dealings with Trockey himself. I discovered Cain's Book in 1971 when I was 20 years old. And in 1972, I fell in with a group of people my own age who were editing a magazine called Gum. And that's it here. Glasgow University magazine, although none of us were at the university. We hijacked this magazine and tried to turn it into something that wasn't really a university magazine. And in this issue, which I just dug out the other day, there's my piece about Trockey, which is 4,000 words long. It was the first piece I ever wrote, really. There's also an interview with Stephen Grappelli, which I had completely forgotten about, and an interview with Lindsay Anderson, the filmmaker. So it wasn't bad for a university magazine in Glasgow in the 70s. By the end of that year, 1972, I was knocking on Trockey's door. By the spring of 73, I had published the article about him, which is in here, based on an interview, and it was probably, and this only occurred to me the other day, the longest article that had appeared about Trockey in Britain to that date. Certainly in Scotland. Possibly the longest article about Trockey that had appeared anywhere until that date. Now, there were a number of things about Kane's book. I'll assume that everybody here is not entirely familiar with it, but I'll just say it was a great book when you were young. When you were young and seditious and of a revolutionary cast of mind, Kane's book was a fabulous discovery. And for us in Glasgow, one of the appealing things was that it was partly set in Glasgow. It was set in New York among heroin addicts, but it was also set in Glasgow because there's a lot about his childhood. Now in the 1970s, the early 70s, this was rather unusual. We were accustomed to reading French literature or American literature. We tried to avoid English literature for practical reasons. But Scottish literature didn't really feature on our self-made syllabi. So to discover something like this that came from Glasgow and was so, I don't really want to use the word hip, but it really was hip, was really an extraordinary discovery. Part of the reason that it was so hip was because of the form of the book. It's the anti-novel. We were used to looking to France for experimental literature. But Kane's book questioned all the assumptions of narrative fiction while managing to tell a compelling story at the same time. And at that time, there were some things that to me were almost magical in Kane's book. For example, the main character, Joe Necky, is obviously Alex Trocky. He quotes, he's sitting around a fire with some fellow junkies, and he quotes from a book. Someone says, "Read to us from Kane's book, Joe." And he quotes from Kane's book. Now, what he quotes is not actually part of this book that you're holding in your hand. Kane's book, so it's as if there was a metaphysical realm beyond this in which another book called Kane's book existed. That kind of thing thrilled me at the time. The other thing, the third thing, was the subject matter. I wasn't much into drugs myself, then or later, but I knew plenty of people who were, including a number of casualties. But nevertheless, drugs were exciting, dramatic, even romantic, even literary, if you think of Cocteau and Baudelaire. And it was a relatively new subject matter in 20th century British literature. And no one, and I say this without fear of being challenged, no one wrote about drugs like Trocky, not even Burroughs. So, our magazine was edited by a fellow called Jack Haggerty. No one here will have heard of. He was my best friend. He was a very sophisticated character. And we didn't, as I say, none of us were students, so we didn't really have an office for this magazine. The office was in a cafe next to Glasgow, next to Hillhead subway station. There's a little metro in Glasgow. It's called the Subway. And there was a cafe there, and that was our office. And the office telephone was in a red telephone box just outside. And Jack was very urbane character, very advanced, with very advanced tastes in literature. Very mature in a way that I wasn't. But he was very good in the telephone box. And he must have had a very large supply of 2p coins, which was what you needed at the time, to press them in hard. Because he was always looking for ideas for the magazine, and I suggested Alexander Trocky, and he didn't really know about Trocky, but Trocky was my kind of personal passion. And I said I'd like to write a piece about him for the magazine, and Jack accepted it, and then he went out to the office telephone in the telephone box, and he called up John Calder, who was the publisher of this book, very famous publisher, and he got Trocky's telephone number. Then he rang up Trocky to say that he was sending his reporter down south from Glasgow to London to get the story. And Trocky was flattered and said that he was willing to welcome the reporter from Glasgow University magazine, and that was me. And then I rang from the telephone box to speak to Trocky to arrange times and so on. The telephone box is no longer there, unfortunately, so it can't be turned into a great Scottish literary monument. I think it ought to be. Anyway, there's the drama of drugs in Kane's book. There's the drama of Trocky's Scottish background. But the greatest drama of all in this book is the drama of the self. Partly with the help of heroin, about the effects of which he wrote magnificently, Trocky was able to dramatize the very fact of consciousness, of intelligence, of being, with an assurance that I can confidently say is unique, and it's certainly unique to me at the time. And now here I was, 2 weeks after all the arrangement had been made, knocking on that self's door in London, in Observatory Gardens, where Trocky lived. It's a street that connects High Street, Kensington, with Notting Hill Gate. There's a street connecting the two, and off that is Observatory Gardens. And I rang the bell, and Trocky came to the door, and of course it was at our appointed time, but said that he didn't feel like doing it that day, and could I come back the next day. And in the meantime, he gave me some things to read, which were mainly by him, and off I went. Now I just want to say this, that Trocky was a very charming man. Everybody who met him fell under his spell. One of his gimmicks, which I witnessed more than once, was to say, when he opened the door, and he had a very strong Scottish accent, despite having lived in Paris and New York and then London. "I'm just about to give myself a fix. Can you wait?" To which, of course, you replied that you could. He gave me a copy of Helen and Desire, which is his most famous erotic book, and a copy of an article by Edward Dorn, I remember. And he also gave me a copy of the Sigma Portfolio. The Sigma was his revolutionary movement. It was the invisible insurrection of a million minds. And the Sigma Portfolio involved articles by a variety of people. They included Michael McClure, Norman Mailer, Robert Creeley, Trocky himself, of course, and a piece by William Burroughs. And in the course of our meeting, I spent quite a lot of time with him on that, for that interview, a couple of days. But in the course of that, Trocky, knew that we were doing the magazine, and when he gave me this Burroughs piece, it was called M.O.B., My Own Business, which is a famous Burroughs phrase. But he said, but I think this little piece was unpublished at the time. So he said, why don't you why don't you publish this piece by Bill in your magazine? And I said, well, we could publish a piece by William Burroughs in Glasgow University magazine. But how on earth would I get permission? And he said, I'll give you the number. He lives in Mayfair. Just ring up Bill and ask him. Say I told you to phone. So when I got back to Glasgow, this gives me the opportunity to relate my dealings with William Burroughs, which were brief but memorable. When I got back to Glasgow, after a lot of anxiety, walking around the red telephone box, working up the courage to ring Burroughs, I finally phoned and got Burroughs on the phone, and I said in my stammering way, I said, Mr. Burroughs, I explained who I was, and I explained about Alex Crotty, and he said, yeah. I said, well, you know, we run this magazine in Glasgow, and he said, yeah. I said, well, the thing is that Trocky gave me this piece by you, it's called MOB, it's from the Sigma portfolio. Yeah! I'm telling you, this is verbatim, I swear to you. I said, well, the thing is, Alex thought it was possible we could publish it in our magazine. He said, yeah! I said, so it's okay, we can go ahead. He said, yeah! And this is when he really got loquacious. I said, well, if you give me your address, I'll send you a copy of the magazine when it's published. He said, 8 Duke Street, St. James. And he put it in. And that was my historic conversation with William Burroughs. And we did publish it. Not in this issue. Anyway, Trocky, as I said, was evangelical about the beneficial effects of heroin, and this was part of his outsider persona, an anti-society stance. Drug taking removed him from the despond of mundane existence. It was a matter of principle not to give in to the limitations of the socialized man or woman. Now, as I said, to naive types like me, the drug taking had a romantic aspect, but my editor, Jack, was more pragmatic and more mature, and he insisted that I read to Trocky a few lines from an article which had recently appeared in the Sunday Times by Cyril Connolly. And I think it's quite interesting to read, to recall this little conversation, because of that, say, Trocky was a proponent of drug use, hard drug use, but this does show to an extent that he drew back from that. So I read to him from Cyril Connolly's article. A striking observation is the anti-intellectual climate that prevails in the networks. All those who have known someone addicted to drugs will have remarked on the increasing indifference to reality, whether to the time of day, or reading, or any of the pleasures and passions, food, drink, love, sex, places of art, or the acquisition of knowledge, which makes life worth living, friendship a joy, conversation a pleasure. Trocky took this seriously, and he tried to answer it by reference to the great figures of the past. And I think it's also interesting to recall what he said. This is from the piece that I wrote in here. I photocopied this page. So I wrote here, Trocky looked at me a little sadly. What is one going to say about that? I suppose up to a point it's true, but it's referring to a particular group of people who, whether they used drugs or not, would not be involved in this or that intellectual pursuit. I think it's true that many people who use drugs do use them as armor against experience, but I don't think that could have been said about Coleridge, for example, or De Quincey, who, if nothing else, were intellectuals. And what put the skids under this outsider stance that Trocky had assumed was the difficulty of obtaining the drugs he wanted and the penalties attached to doing so. One of the reasons he returned to the United Kingdom from the United States was to be able to obtain drugs on the National Health Service. In short, the great outsider became totally dependent, more so than most, on the society he wanted the world to think he was plotting to overthrow. Who ever heard of a state-subsidized outlaw? He had fallen into a trap outlined in Keynes' book, with regard to literature, he writes about with regard to literature, in a passage that's always delighted me. This is from Kane's book. For centuries, we in the West have been dominated by the Aristotelian impulse to classify. Even that sort of sentence thrilled me. The Aristotelian impulse to classify. I couldn't have dreamed of myself, making an utterance like that. It is no doubt because conventional classifications become part of prevailing economic structure that all real revolt is hastily fixed like a bright butterfly on a classificatory pin. The anti-play, Godot, being from one point of view unanswerable, is with all speed acclaimed best play of the year. Anti-literature is rendered innocuous by granting it a place in conventional histories of literature. Ending with one of my favorite aphorisms from Kane's book. My friends will know what I mean when I say that I deplore our contemporary industrial writers. Let them dedicate a year to pinball and think again. And the passages about pinball in Kane's book, by the way, are among the best. No one writes about drugs like Trocky, but no one writes about pinball like Trocky. The book is recommended for that alone. Now, just to deepen this portrait a bit, I hope, I'll say that an outsider stance is one thing, but the persona of a bad man, a harmful creature, is quite another, and Trocky had that reputation. When I first knocked on his door, my girlfriend at the time came with me, and naturally we spoke about our brief encounter. That wasn't the day, it was the day before the interview, but it was our first encounter. Naturally we spoke about it later. While I was overawed at having laid eyes on my hero at last, my first sight, I remember, he was at the top of the stairs. He looked down. I spoke through an intercom, and the first time I had ever come across one of those intercom things where you press the buzzer and the person says, "Hello, who's that?" and automatically opens the door. Glasgow was still, in the 19th century. But I remember looking up at this enormous belly in a black t-shirt, and of course a very powerful nose Trocky had. That was enough for me. But my girlfriend at the time said that she could smell evil about his person. And she wasn't the only one. While I was researching my book Paris Interzone, in which there is quite a lot about Trocky, I went to visit a man called John Stevenson, who was one of Trocky's fellow authors at the Olympia Press in Paris. John Stevenson wrote under the name of Marcus Van Hella, and he was very prolific. And after I left John Stevenson's, he wrote me a letter. And this is what he had to say, which I think is quite interesting. I have sent him, or maybe I have told him about my girlfriend. He said, "I particularly liked the comment of the girl who said she could smell evil about his person. It reminded me of a comparatively bourgeois dinner I once took Alex to at Vaucresson, outside Paris. He was absolutely on his best behavior, interesting but mild. Afterwards, the hostess told me that if ever she'd met a man imbued with an evil spirit, it's your friend Alex Trocky." I think a lot of women felt this way, although it didn't stop them being fascinated. I usually found it was women who were particularly strong on the point that there seemed to be no real emotion in his books. But if even if all that was the flip side of charm, charm there still was. And in order that I don't end this little talk on a negative note, I want to recall my final meeting with Trocky, which was maybe 10 years, not quite 10 years after the first one. It was in 1981. He was still living in the same flat in Observatory Gardens. His wife, Lynn, had died of heroin-related complications. One of his teenage sons had died. And Trocky was still addicted to heroin. And rather touching in a funny kind of way. And as always, convivial. His apartment was completely covered in papers and books. I remember some books by Lawrence Durrell hanging around for some reason. I don't know why I remember that. And he said, I must sort all this out. But he said it in that way that let you know that he never would. It's like sometimes you go into someone's house and they say, I must tidy up one day, and you know they're never going to. And in those days, by that time, Trocky was running a little bookstall in Kensington Market. And he also traded in stamps. The curious thing about Alex that, you know, there was this outsider, outlaw, practically criminal. He did spend time on the run from the law, and of course heroin addict, but he had these curious enthusiasms like stamps. Not what you expect. And also books. And he was he'd be typically very knowledgeable about that kind of thing. And he sold me, I remember that day, 3 first editions of books by James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room, Another Country, and Nobody Knows My Name, in the first American editions. Sold for token prices, of course. That was, again, part of Alex's charm. And then we went to one of those little drinking clubs, all-day drinking clubs, which existed in the days before all-day opening of pubs. You had to join this club and go. And this was in Kensington Church Street, and it was called Jimmy's, I remember. And when we went inside, Alex ordered for each of us the Scotsman's traditional tipple, a hoff and a hoff. Or as he said, a hoff and a hoff, Jimmy! Jimmy, of course, is what people in Glasgow how people in Glasgow address each other if they're total strangers. Can you tell me the way to Ibrox, Jimmy? But the fact that this place was called Jimmy's, and Jimmy was behind the bar, and I was called Jimmy, gave it all kind of, again, a metafictional resonance, which existed only in my head, I think. Anyway. Then we said, a half, Jimmy, which means a half pint of beer and a glass of whiskey on the side. Because in Glasgow, a glass of whiskey is called a hoff. I remember the barman hadn't a clue what he was talking about. But I did. And there we were, 2 Scotsmen, one still relatively young, the other getting old, in a London bar, united by drugs of the more traditional kind. That's all.
Thank you, Jim. The stamp collector who smells of evil is now kind of etched in my mind. That was tremendous. Now I've got a couple of questions that I wanted to throw out, but also I know there are quite a few Trocky fans here, so I didn't want to sort of dominate that. So I'm just going to ask Jim a couple of questions, and then are you happy for people to?
Of course.
I think the image that you had at the end really made me think of an account in your book. I'm just going to quote this in Parasynthesis, which I highly recommend. There's a lovely line, we say, like Baldwin, like Richard Wright, these are characters in Jim's book, Trotsky was impelled from his native land as if by an independent force. The weight of his oppression he had to struggle free of was not racial, it was provincial. And I'm really interested in this and the way that Hugh MacDiarmid called him cosmopolitan scum at the, and that was at the
Edinburgh
Writers, yes. And how there's a really interesting facet of Trotsky's work, this internationalism. And he would have been appalled, I think, by the kind of Brexit idea and this idea of uniting people. And I just wondered how he sits in terms of, you mentioned Scottish literature and where that, was it the provincialism, it just sort of fed up of Glasgow at that time?
Yeah. Well, he skipped London and went straight from Glasgow to Paris in probably 1951, and then began writing Young Adam, which was his first, let's say, serious novel. He wrote a lot of pornographic books for the Olympia Press, and then he began writing Kane's book. And at the conference that Doug just referred to in Edinburgh, I think it was 62, Kane's book had been published in the US, but not in Britain. And he got into a squabble with Hugh MacDiarmid, who at that time was a leading nationalist figure. And Trotsky, who probably hadn't read very much MacDiarmid, it has to be said, swept all that kind of stuff aside, and also the work of MacDiarmid's contemporaries, Norman MacCaig and Sidney Goodson Smith and Robert Garriott, I think were all there, all formidable poets. And Trotsky said, and I think this is just about right, he said, all